Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at the United Nations Security Council. Though I've been looking at the United Nations quite regularly. Last show I mentioned the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, but this time I'm looking at the Security Council within the United Nations itself. And this Security Council is an arm of the United Nations that deals with security. There are 6 arms, or branches you could say, within the organization. And the Security Council looks at the security and the enforcement of security within the United Nations. So I'm looking at the functions of the Security Council. So there are around 10. I'm going to go through all of them. And the first is to maintain international peace and security in accordance with the principles and purposes of the United Nations, to investigate any dispute or situation which might lead to international friction, to recommend methods of adjusting such disputes or terms of settlement, to formulate plans for the establishment of a system to regulate arms and armaments, such as this agreement between Iran and certain countries, or the rest of the world, I would say, to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. Because this idea that if Iran has nuclear weapons, it intends to use them against Israel, which is a fallacy. First of all, Iran doesn't want to have nuclear weapons. It wants a peaceful nuclear power system where it uses nuclear power instead of maybe coal power. But this narrative that if it has nuclear weapons, that it would attack Israel is something they use to keep pressure on Iran and put sanctions and also to destabilize its economy. To determine the existence of a threat to peace or act of aggression and to recommend what action should be taken. To call on members to apply economic sanctions and the other measures not involving the use of force to prevent or stop aggression. To take military action against an aggressor. To recommend admission of new members, to exercise the trusteeship functions of the United Nations in strategic areas. And the last one is to recommend the General Assembly, the appointment of the Secretary General, together with the Assembly, to elect judges of the International Court of Justice. Okay. So in terms of the Security Council, that's its purposes and its role within the United Nations. But in terms of who the members are and what it consists of, there are 15 members of the Security Council. And out of these are 5 permanent members. These are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And these are the problematic members of the Security Council, as I'll explain later on. There are 10 non-permanent members who serve terms of 2 years. And well, that is it basically in terms of explaining or describing how the membership structure and purposes of the Security Council is structured or is organized. But in terms of well, we know recently, those who have been watching the news and aware of certain activities or what's going on in the world in terms of wars and decisions made about atrocities in the world. If we look at the situation in Gaza, in West Asia, I won't call it Israel because that's a false nation created by certain people who want to dominate the region. But in terms of what's happening in Gaza and the fact that America, who is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, always vetoes or stops decisions being made in terms of resolutions made to stop Israel doing what it's doing in Gaza. The US usually votes against any kind of action to be taken against Israel in what it's doing in committing genocide and all the killings that are taking place there. Anyway, there's a report by Oxfam called Vetoing Humanity. It looks at 23 of the world's most protracted conflicts over the past 10 years. I'll name the countries: Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Libya, Niger, Palestine, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Yemen. Found that 27 of the 30 Security Council vetoes cast were basically on Palestine, Syria, and Ukraine. None of them were in Africa, and there are many African countries mentioned here. So the report concludes that the 5 permanent members are exploiting their exclusive voting and negotiating powers to suit their own geopolitical interests. In doing so, they have undermined the Council's ability to maintain international peace. So basically, they're using the veto power to stop resolutions that would punish their friends or interfere with their own interests, basically. For example, Israel wants to take over the land of Gaza. That's why it's causing this genocide in that part of the world. America, although it's claiming, or the previous president was claiming, or previous regime was claiming that what that was not supposed to happen. This current President Trump is saying that Gaza should be cleared out because the people there are suffering, so they should basically leave. Yet it's their land, or you could argue it's their land. There are other stories or narratives around that issue, but it's their territory. They've been there for a couple thousand years, and this so-called regime, or this so-called state of Israel, or the Jewish people, as they see themselves, think it's their land because they were there before, they had a kingdom there before. But this kingdom itself, when it was formed, something like 3,500 years ago, there were also invaders who came onto the territory and attacked, according to their line of thinking, or into their biblical stories. They attacked and killed the Canaanites and took over the land. But historically, it's shown that they settled on the land without killing off the Canaanites. So they intermingled with the Canaanites and occupied that land. Or they intermingled racially. So some of them, you could say they have Canaanite images, but so do the Palestinians. And then you also have the original Canaanites that, though they are probably few nowadays, some because of intermingling and some because they were killed off. But basically, the Israelis are not the only people that have claim to the land. Anyway, let's move on with this. This is from the UN Security Council. It's from the Oxfam report again, I should say. While the UN General Assembly has passed 77 resolutions over the last decade supporting Palestinian self-determination and human rights and an end to Israel's illegal occupation, the US has used its veto power 6 times to block resolutions perceived as unfavorable to its ally Israel. The US vetoes have created a permissive environment for Israel to expand illegal settlements in the Palestinian territory. And they're doing so freely, basically. There's no one really stopping them. And this is according to the Security Council report. The Security Council report is an organization that makes sure there's transparency within the Security Council. Basically, they monitor the Security Council. And they're going on to say here, the world has suffered gravely from the Security Council's failure to have a meaningful impact on the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, and in Sudan, Myanmar, and Yemen, also in Afghanistan. These council failures contribute to the international law unraveling, normalizing violations and impunity for them, and further weakening the universality of norms. The political cost of atrocity crimes is now shockingly low, even for plausible cases of genocide. The Charter presupposed that the Council's core members would stand up for its core values, and often they have not. So basically, because of the ability of one, I'll explain the voting structure in a minute, but because of the way the voting structure is, one of the 5 permanent countries can vote against a resolution, even if all the other 14 members vote in favor. That one vote can stop the resolution going through. So let's take a look at the veto section itself, the veto issue itself. So this is from the Security Council report again. Beyond permanency itself, the veto power is probably the UN's Charter's most significant distinction between permanent and non-permanent members. So it's going on to say that Article 727 describes because the word veto itself is not mentioned in the UN Charter or the Security Council regulations, but by way of how the voting system is structured, they say that it's a veto when one of the permanent members votes against the resolution, because they stop the resolution from going through. So anyway, permanent members use the veto to defend their national interest, to uphold a tenet of their foreign policy, or in some cases to promote a single issue of particular importance to a state. Since the 16th of February 1946, when the USSR basically cast the first veto on a draft resolution regarding the withdrawal of foreign troops. So the first veto was used back in 1946. And these are the Article 26, Article 26 and 27. Each member, this is explaining the voting system of the Security Council. Each member of the Security Council shall have one vote. Decisions of Security Council on procedural matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members. Decisions of the Security Council in all other matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring permanent 5 provided in decisions under Chapter 6. And it says here also, a party to a dispute shall abstain from voting. So what does that mean when it says a party? Is somebody directly causing the violation or at war or whatever is not supposed to be part of the vote? But looking at the Russia situation, Russia was involved because there's a discussion around Russia and Ukraine and the war that's going on there, and Russia is seen as the aggressor. So Russia should have abstained from the voting in this situation, but it didn't, and it vetoed, basically. It voted against the resolution for certain actions to be taken against itself. And then you have the situation now in Gaza, in which America is almost at party because it's providing most of the arms to Israel to commit what it's committing, but it also is the main country that's vetoing any strong actions being taken against Israel. So this idea that a party to dispute, I think they're not really following, they're basically ignoring certain of the regulations within their own charter, and nobody's really pulling them up for that. And continuing, this is part of a meeting, the 78th UN meeting, discussing the same issue. Not the Gaza issue, the voting issue itself. There was a broad support for expanding the membership in both permanent and non-permanent categories. This is of the Council, and for underrepresented regions and continents such as Africa and Asia to have a meaningful seat at the table. Other named countries that they thought should be welcome additions to the 15-member bodies. Some speakers whose country situations have been on the Council's agenda for many years said that the body was skewed in its approach to international politics as well as international peace and security. For example, it's saying the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea said that the present Security Council structure is centered on the West and does not reflect today's reality, thereby rendering it a political instrument of specific forces. When the UN was formed in 1945, many countries were not yet independent, and these 5 permanent members were made to be members of the Security Council. Yet the UN itself has changed vastly over time since those days. Many countries in the Global South in particular, became independent, and some of them at least should have been made permanent members of the Security Council. So the argument is that these 5 permanent members are the more powerful countries in the world, and it enables them to veto decisions against themselves or against their allies, and giving them almost a control of how the UN works when it comes to enforcing certain regulations. And continuing, this is from the Oxfam report again. China, France, Russia, the UK and the US took responsibility for global security at the United Nations Security Council. In a now bygone colonial age, this is back in the 1940s, the contradictions of their acting as judge and jury of their own military alliances, interests and adventures are incompatible with the world seeking peace and justice for all, said Oxfam International Executive Director. For instance, in 2023, Russia vetoed a 9-month extension of cross-border assistance to North Syria and left 4.1 million people with little or no access to food, water and medicine. And Russia has also used its veto 4 times on Ukraine, despite being an aggressor in the conflict, as I was saying. And continuing, I think this last part is Russia again. This is Russia almost defending the use of the veto, not their use of it, but the general idea of the veto itself. As the only permanent council member speaking during today's debate, the representative of the Russian Federation said the veto has on more than one occasion saved the UN from being drawn into dubious adventures. This was made clear recently when the United States and its satellites tried to push a council resolution in support of Israel's action in Gaza. Only the veto by Russia and China saved the world from a shameful scenario. So he's arguing if the veto were not provided for under the UN Charter, the Council would become just a body for uncontrollable stamping of documents that are beneficial to a narrow group of countries. And the UN would basically saying that the UN would repeat the mistakes of the League of Nations, which was the earlier version of the United Nations, which was replaced by the UN in 1945. So Russia is defending the idea of the veto situation, but I think many are arguing that the veto should be gotten rid of because it's this archaic structure that was there, that was formed in 1945, and it was formed primarily by the European countries of the United Nations. Some argue that it was formed so they could continue defending their interests if there was some kind of resolution which it would have hurt Western dominance, you could almost argue. They could vote against it. Anyway, this is the back to the Oxfam report. So, as the Summit of the Future kicks off this week to envision and revitalize, there was a Summit of the Future. It took place, I think, the 22nd of September last year in 2024. So they're looking at making change. Well, the idea of changing certain aspects of the UN operations has been there for several years. But in terms of the Security Council, no real change has taken place. So anyway, as the Summit of the Future kicks off this week to envision a revitalized UN, Oxfam calls for wholesale reform of the UN Security Council, including the abolition of the P5 veto power. So they're saying that should get rid of the veto power. We need a new vision for a UN system that meets its original ambitions and made fit for purpose for today's reality, the General Secretary is saying. A council that works for the global majority, not the powerful few. This starts with the renouncing the veto and pen-holding privilege of P5 and expanding membership to more countries. And here, from the Global Governance Forum website, it's talking about how France has been advocating since the mid-2000s for changes to the Security Council and the veto power. Permanent member France has advocated a voluntary restraint on the veto on the part of the permanent members since the mid-2000s. In a summary of the event, the co-chairs called the P5 to voluntarily and collectively pledge not to use the veto in case of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes on a large scale. So war crimes on a small scale will be okay. Anyway, However, from among the permanent members, only the UK has supported the initiative. So, well, France is not a member of the, is it? Anyway, only the UK has supported the initiative. So, and the General Secretary, or the Secretary General of the UN is talking about, although he hasn't mentioned getting rid of the veto, they're talking about changing, that these are new days basically, and the UN needs to adjust its structure to meet the way the world is today. In its declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN in 2020, it recognized that the world of today is very different from what it was when the United Nations was created 75 years ago, and it commits to reform so as to ensure a more agile, effective, and accountable organization that can deliver better in the field and adapt to global challenges. So basically that's a look at the Security Council and its faults, and the fact that I'm looking for something I mentioned which I didn't mention earlier on. That's what I'm looking for now. Here it is. Here it is. So I saw I mentioned pen holding. Pen holding. This is the Oxfam report again. The report critiques another of the P5's powers called pen holding, which allows them to lead a negotiation and direct how resolutions are drafted and tabled or ignored. So the P5 can lead investigations regarding any crimes of humanity and so forth taking place, and they can lead how the discussions take place and direct how the resolutions are structured, or even ignore certain crimes against humanity that are taking place. So basically they can coerce, not only coerce, they can manipulate the Security Council in terms of how issues are dealt with. While France and the UK have not used their veto in the last decade, they and the US have held the pen on 2/3 of resolutions relating to the 23 protracted crises studied by Oxfam. The UK holds the pen on Yemen, for example, where it has a colonial legacy and strategic interest to maintain the maritime routes in that region. In 2023, Mali objected to French pen holding given what it considered acts of aggression and destabilizing there. So countries that have interest, not just in the vote itself, but in the investigations and negotiations over the resolutions. So countries that have interest in those regions are likely to lead the discussions or negotiations in a particular direction, even to the extent that nothing is properly resolved about what to do about the issues they're discussing. So anyways, that's a look at the UN Security Council, which obviously the UN was formed at a time when there were a few global south countries that were independent, and it was formed as an extension of the League of Nations, which was also a UN Western dominated organization, which was also formed from the Concert of Europe period between 1918 and 1914, just before World War I started. These are European international organizations which they formed basically to increase cooperation around the world, initially in Europe, but around the world, but they wanted to create these structures based on their terms. So they had to create structures within these organizations which would allow them to have some level of control or directive of how these organizations operate. So they could find themselves in situations where they may be punished or something will go against their interests, but they had to have something there that would prevent that. In this case, I think the veto plays that role. So anyway, that's a look at the veto on the United Nations Security Council and some of its faults. That's it for now.